David R.B. Animator, director, developer, creator. An inspiration to, without a doubt, hundreds of thousands and one of the most influential figures in the entire Minecraft animation community. For almost 15 years, he has run the YouTube channel Black Plasma Studios, which sits at almost 10 million subscribers today. I was one of his fans once, but sadly the thumbnail of this video is not exaggerated. Behind closed doors, David was, and still is, a horrible person. He has been toxic, abusive, racist, pedophilic, and a groomer, and the worst part of all of this is that he's been able to get away with every one of his vile actions for over half a decade. If you think these claims are far out of left field, I urge you to stick with me. The following video presents information that, in my opinion, proves David guilty of everything I just said beyond reasonable doubt. My intention is to inform, not to gain clout in any way. I firmly believe all of this, but I never wanted to. David was a man I idolized and longed to be like. Now, well, I'm ashamed to have ever thought that way. I have a few disclaimers to get through before I start. Normally when I include those in my videos, I tell you when to skip to so you don't have to listen to them, but this time I strongly advise you pay attention. Firstly, I would like to preface this expose by clarifying that this is not a Black Plasma Studios hate video. I have been in the BPS fandom for over 2.5 years and still largely enjoy the animations they produce. I am a friend of Mont27P, one of the current directors, and have connections to multiple members of the Black Plasma community moderator team as well as several patrons. This video is about David and the horrific things he's done as an individual. Although I expect them to hold him accountable after I bring everything to light, most of the directors, animators, and moderators working for BPS did nothing wrong themselves, and I want to reiterate that to all of you. Do not harass them. Secondly, the production of this expose has been overseen at every step by David's victims, and all the information I'm about to present has been included with their express permission. I have pledged not to share any information they are not comfortable with being shared. Please understand that this may leave you with further inquiries you might not be able to get answers for, as the privacy and boundaries of the victims matter more. Do not, under any circumstances, harass or pester the victims about their experiences after you're done watching this video. In doing so, you would actively be making a difficult and traumatic situation even harder for them, and if that's something you're willing to do, go f*** yourself. Lastly, please don't make assumptions before finishing the video. You will need to hear everything first, as the information I'm presenting will be crucial to your understanding of the situation. You'd think this would go without saying, but this is the internet, so I do feel the need to make that disclaimer. With all that being said, it's time to finally get into the story of David R.B. Before I tell you all the things he did behind closed doors, let's begin at the surface by describing the history of David as a creator and the history of BPS, the history already known to the fans. David R.B. is actually a relatively new alias despite how long he's been on the internet. Up until a few years now, David called himself Arbiter617. Indeed, this was inspired by the character of the same name from the Halo franchise, which brings us back to how David started out on YouTube so long ago. The Black Plasma Studios channel was created by David on March 8, 2008. While today it's known for its vastly popular Minecraft animations raking in millions of views each, it had a much more humble beginning. The first projects David created were all about the Halo video games. They were machinimas, which meant they were gameplay recordings edited into cohesive films. It's very odd to look back and comprehend that this is where BPS began. These Halo machinimas definitely had a certain charm to them, and David was able to cultivate somewhat of an audience around his creations. However, 2015 was the year BPS would transform into what it's known as today. I can't claim to know exactly what happened, but what I am aware of is that David got together with a group of friends to bring BPS to new heights. This group consisted of Samuel Kyber, ROA Nitrox, and Eagle Empire. From what I know, they decided to shift BPS in the direction of Minecraft animations as they likely realized they would be incredibly profitable. And they were right, because when David, Sam, Nitrox, and Eagle started making animations, the channel's popularity absolutely skyrocketed. However, only 2 of those 4 people are still involved with BPS today. Eagle left after only making a few animations allegedly to focus on growing an audience on Twitch. From what I've been told, Eagle was always more of a gamer than an animator, and I can definitely agree with that premise because his animations were pretty subpar in my opinion, even compared to the rest of BPS's catalog at the time. Nitrox remained for a while, but from what I can gather, he quit sometime between late 2019 and mid-2020. In a video uploaded to his personal channel, he claimed he left due to horrendous working conditions. Sam commented on it and admitted he and the rest of BPS had failed Nitrox, and he pledged to create a better environment for members in the future. In any case, with Nitrox gone, that left only David and Sam out of the original team of animators who made BPS what it was. Throughout the years, however, more animators joined the studio, including Little Thomas, Skyfall, Omeletto, Mont27P, and Matt Squared, formerly known as Night of Doom. Their combined efforts grew BPS to extreme heights that David could only have dreamed of when he first created the channel and started recording his machinimas. And now he stood at the top of an empire he and his co-workers had forged, a community million strong invested in the animations he created. And with that much power at his fingertips, he was ready to unleash a project he'd been working on for years, a project of a much greater scale, the original Minecraft animation series, Songs of War. Songs of War released with a decent start. On November 23, 2019, the first episode was uploaded to BPS, raking in about as much views as most standard animations did. It was either up or down from there, and unfortunately it ended up being down. The following episodes quickly dwindled in views, with some only barely breaking 1 million views. This would be incredible in the eyes of most creators, but it was pitiful by the standards BPS had previously set for themselves. Although the first season of Songs of War cultivated a very passionate fanbase, the series did not make enough money or rake in enough views for director David to renew it for its next 2 seasons. As such, Songs of War was cancelled, and with that, David was also done with animating for BPS in general. He got into game design and began work on his next project, an indie game by the name of Arcadian Rift. To this day, he continues to run the company as the CEO. And that's where the story of David RB and Black Plasma Studios ends. At least, as far as most people know. And by God, I wish I could stop the video here and leave you with that sweet facade. I wish I didn't have to tell you the truth about this vile, disgusting man, but I have a responsibility and an obligation to use my platform as a long-standing member of the Songs of War fandom and the Black Plasma community to ensure this piece of shit is deplatformed and held responsible for what he's done. His pattern of predatory behavior could repeat again if left unknown, and I will not allow him to claim another victim. David has had years and years of undeserved peace. Up until this point, he's gotten away with everything. Well, I say no more. Tuesday, September 27, 2022. I came home from school after a completely normal, average day. I was shocked when I opened Discord and checked one of my group chats, only to find that one of my friends, who I'll be leaving anonymous, had left a message claiming David RB, the director of Songs of War, the founder of BPS himself, was in fact a piece of shit. Not only that, but apparently he also groomed a member of his community and a former Songs of War fan artist lost in time. As you can imagine, I was very confused and upset. I wanted to know exactly where my friend had gotten this information, but they weren't online at the time, so instead I reached out to one of their other friends, V, who was also a Songs of War fan artist at one point and a close friend of Time. V is not his real name, obviously, as I'm protecting his anonymity, but it's a nickname he gave himself when he edited the script, so it's a nickname I'll go with. Luckily, he had exactly the answers I was seeking. V backed up exactly what my friend had said in the group chat and elaborated upon it. What he told me was that both he and Time had once worked for David as concept artists for Arcadian Rift. David and Time had been in a relationship from around 2020 to 2021, unbeknownst to the wider community. Time was an adult when this happened, but David was still a toxic partner and frequently violated her boundaries. Despite her being asexual and making this clear many times, David refused to respect this, even blaming her for it, and repeatedly pressured her into sexual conversations and erotic roleplay. He also frequently ranted to her about all his previous partners despite her expressing her discomfort and displayed a hell of a lot of Asian fetishism, which I would say is a form of racism. He dyed his hair black and expressed wanting to move to San Francisco, both to supposedly fit in more with the Asian community. Time and V are both Asian, and David knew this. It was in fact part of the reason he chose to date Time. More concerning is the fact that according to Time, who had told this to V, David once made a comment to her about how if V was older, he would date V before quickly deleting it. V was, and still is, a minor. Although he's a transgender man, he identified as a woman at the time. These are all things David knew, and for someone to make a comment like this, well, it's fucked up, simple as that. So, those are the experiences Time and V had with David. From this alone, he is already an abuser, a predator, and a racist who fetishizes and fantasizes about Asian women. Now, I already hear some of you telling me that there's no evidence of any of this. After all, you proclaim, how do we know Time didn't simply make any of this up? Well, I'll get to that. Right now, I'm only laying out a basic summary of the allegations, and an analysis of the evidence will come afterward. There's still much more to cover before we reach that point, because soon after V and I started investigating David for more information, his horrible past truly came to light. What I've described is already awful, but unfortunately, it gets so much worse. While conducting our investigation, V and I took note of a particular person of interest, Toriable, or Tori for short. From what we knew, Tori was once affiliated with BPS, but what concerned us was the fact that she started out at age 13 and was a minor the entire time. Despite this, she was a huge moderator on the server and the community manager of the games. We heard rumors about David and Tori having been way too close despite David being far over age at the time, 9 years older than Tori to be exact. Nothing was outright confirmed yet, but given what we already knew about David, this wasn't looking too good for him. V and I knew we had to get in contact with Tori, and the next day, we did. Wednesday, September 28, 2022. V successfully reached out to Tori, and what she told him revealed how disgusting David truly was. Tori explained to V and I that David had abused his position of power over her as the head of BPS to groom her and sexually coerce her with nudes and erotic roleplay. He apparently didn't want to officially date her until she was 16, because for some reason I guess he didn't see an issue with a relationship between a 16-year-old girl and a 25-year-old man. He's messed up in the head. Go figure. During this time, David exhibited a similar pattern of behavior as the one he exhibited during his relationship with Time, of which I described earlier. He was toxic, abusive, manipulative, and part of the reason why he sought out Tori was because he had a fetishized infatuation with her accent. It would be one thing if these allegations were made by one person, but for similar allegations to be made by two different people with no prior contact who were involved with the Black Plasma community at entirely different times is, to say the least, very damning. Now, some of you may still think it's possible that both Tori and Time lied, but don't worry because we're about to get into all the evidence gathered by V and I that, as far as I'm concerned, as much as proves David guilty. So without further ado, let's get right into that. Thursday, September 29, 2022. At this point in the investigation, V and I decided we were going to reach out to everyone we could who'd worked under David before to ask if they had any experiences with him that would align with what we knew so far. Fortunately, I had plenty of connections in the Songs of War fandom, and I was able to get in contact with an animator who worked on this series under David. I'm not going to name this animator as they requested to stay anonymous, but they were able to provide some very vital information. At first, this animator told me they never noticed anything weird or predatory about David besides the fact that he hired random animators, most of whom were minors, and then severely underpaid them. Now, that's quite bad in and of itself, but it doesn't really add to the case about him being a groomer. However, the animator I reached out to was then able to access a private Discord server where they found a 2-year-old conversation between 3 Songs of War animators and none other than Toriable, one of David's earlier victims who, as I said, earlier spoke to V and I and agreed to be mentioned in this video. My contact provided me with screenshots. Tori in this conversation openly stated that not only did David have a thing for her, but that he'd already been exposed before for flirting with another minor and had to deactivate his Twitter account to keep things under wraps. That means David allegedly had another victim. 2 of the 3 animators in this conversation have been censored as we were unable to get in contact with them and receive their permission to mention their names in this video, but I was able to reach out to Red the animator through Twitter, who confirmed that he had indeed been part of this conversation and knew about parts of David's awful history. This means we have evidence that Tori didn't make up any of what she alleged on the spot when we contacted her. The most recently she could have possibly made anything up was November of 2020, since that's when this conversation took place, and it's impossible to imagine why she would lie about something like that. She clearly didn't want clout because she never said any of this publicly. In fact, this video serves as the first time any of Tori's experiences have been made public, and we're still not even delving into specifics in her case because she asked us not to. I don't think she could possibly have come up with false allegations against David back in 2020 and then somehow correctly assumed a YouTuber like me would be able to give her a platform to spread those allegations 2 years later. That would be completely ridiculous, and I sincerely hope no one actually tries to argue that in response to this video because the amount of logical hurdles someone would have to jump through to make a claim like that is absurd. Having discovered that David supposedly had an old Twitter which he deactivated because he was caught flirting with a minor, I decided to do some investigation myself. I spoke to Tori, and she told me this occurred around late 2019 to early 2020, but unfortunately I can't figure out exactly when because the evidence has more or less been scrubbed from the internet. There are 2 Twitter accounts right now claiming to be David, one with the tag TheDavidRB and another with the tag Arbiter617. Only one of these 2, though, is his actual account. That one is TheDavidRB. His tweets only date back to 2020, and he also joined that year, so this is a relatively very new account. As for the other, Arbiter617, their tweets go back to 2019, but according to Tori, David never actually used this account and it was simply made and operated by an impersonator. It's not him, period. So to summarize, there's one account that actually is David, as was made after he was initially exposed and had to deactivate. And there's an older account that existed through the time period Tori identified, but isn't actually David and is just an impersonator, meaning it proves absolutely nothing. The investigation was once again looking pretty bad for him so far, but I still hadn't discovered his old Twitter that he allegedly deactivated. Of course, all evidence of it having existed is scrubbed from the actual site, so I wasn't hopeful I would get anything at first. Until I went to the Wayback Machine and searched up https:/twitter.com/arbiter617, and just like that, I got told the link hadn't been archived. I was so mad. I was about to give up and begrudgingly declare this claim about David flirting with a minor on Twitter unsubstantiated, but that's when I saw it, the text at the bottom. Click here to search for all archive pages under https:/twitter.com/arbiter617. There had to be something. There just had to be. So I clicked that link, and folks, let me tell you, there were results. 22 of them to be exact. Of these 22 total results, the first 18 of them were irrelevant, as they were simply snapshots from the aforementioned impersonator's tweets collected from 2019 to 2020. But those last 4 results? Well, they dated all the way back to 2017 and were collected from a slightly different account link, one with an uppercase A as opposed to the lowercase a of the impersonator's account. So I clicked on one, and unfortunately it turned out to be a raw JSON text instead of a proper tweet. But let's just say this raw text had a lot of valuable information within. Let me just highlight some key phrases. Arbiter617, director of Black Plasma Studios, YouTuber, 3D animator, PC gamer, Hypixel. Whatever account this was from was definitely his, and the fact that this is the only trace of it I could find, well, that's suspicious considering the reason I was told it was deactivated. I will admit this is circumstantial, and unfortunately I don't think we'll be able to find anything else about this, but it does seem likely to me that David did delete his old Twitter to hide evidence of his prior wrongdoings, especially since that's not even a recent allegation. It was first made over 2 years ago, when the deactivation was still fairly recent. So yeah, looking pretty bad for him. Although we most likely won't be able to find out anything else about David's old Twitter account, there is still more evidence against him in other areas. On the 3rd day of the investigation, I spent an hour combing through and recording hundreds, perhaps thousands of messages exchanged on the BPC Discord between David and Tori. This was when Tori was still working for BPS and being groomed by David. First of all, I just want to say, there are messages where people actively ship David and Tori, and David doesn't really say anything about it. Interesting, isn't it? In fact, he seems to be complicit. I wonder what that means. In addition, I was able to find a decent amount of incriminating messages strongly implying that David did indeed groom her through Skype when she was no older than 13 years, just as she told us. For example, we have this exchange, where Tori asked David through a Skype message to make this better. David didn't react surprised here like he would have if he had no idea what Tori was talking about, so this implies the two of them absolutely were talking through Skype at the time. And because this message is so suggestive, it can be fairly assumed from there that there was a sexual element to whatever conversations they may have had back then. Truth be told, I don't know exactly how their conversations went because according to Tori, she hasn't had access to their Skype chats in a long time, but the implications really are quite damning. If you think I'm taking this message out of context, or if you think I've simply faked it, I've uploaded the entire hour-long recording of me combing through the Discord on my 2nd channel, and it's linked in the description. See for yourself. If even that's not enough for you, and you think I spent ages using Inspect Element to alter God knows how many messages on an easily accessible public server to construct a false narrative while perfectly replicating the typing style of multiple people every time, you can check for yourself after you're done watching. Assuming David hasn't freaked out and gone on a deletion spree yet. Next up, I would like to present an assortment of DMs between David and Time, where David references Tori as someone he previously at the least had romantic infatuation with, even when she was a minor. All DMs featured have been done so with the express permission of Time. The same does not go for David, but that's okay because f*** David. So take that as further evidence that David abused Time and Tori. And yet, there's still one last thing. In the investigation group chat containing V and I, Tori sent a picture of David wearing nothing but a bath towel that he had allegedly sent to her when he was still grooming her. Time claims she was sent the same picture too. I've checked with reverse image search, and there isn't a single other place that picture of David shows up. I won't actually put that image in the video because I have a feeling YouTube will be mad about it, and I also don't want to traumatize my viewers, but for anyone who does want to make sure I'm not making this up, you'll find a document linked in the description with that picture and the results of my reverse image search, as well as the rest of the evidence for that matter. Do look at it at your own risk though, because it is quite repulsive. Anyhow, that's all the evidence this investigation has yielded, and it was all evidence V and I were able to gather in only a few days. It feels off to me considering how easy it was. In 1 hour, I was able to find all sorts of incriminating messages supporting all the victims' allegations on the BPC Discord, and David never made any effort to cover it up. I initially wondered if that was because he's simply a f***ing moron, and while I would like to believe that, I think he knew exactly what he was doing, and I think he suspected he would get away with his actions for a long time, possibly for the rest of his life. After combing through the server, it occurred to me that many members of the Discord sat by and spectated all the obviously flirtatious messages between David and Tori, and they said nothing. Which really begs the question, why? Why didn't they speak up? I think the fact that most of the audience at BPS is children and young teens explains it, because it's not like many of them would be able to even realize what was going on behind closed doors. I firmly believe David knew his audience would be young and naive, and he exploited that to get away with everything. That, to me, is a whole other level of evil. At this point in the video, some viewers may still somehow think David is innocent. One criticism I can see being made of this expose is that I technically don't have the full story. I don't have complete proof that Time and Tori aren't just making up false allegations. One might argue I'm making an assumption that they're being honest, and you know what? True. I don't have complete proof, and I am making an assumption. However, I want to bring up Occam's razor here. How many of you actually know what the principle of Occam's razor is? If you think it's the simplest answer is the best, you're wrong. It's actually, the answer requiring the least assumptions is the most plausible. For example, let's set up a hypothetical. Imagine you're just outside your house at night. You see a figure approaching your neighbor's house, and the figure is, for one reason or another, unable to be identified from your vantage point. The figure approaches your neighbor's house, opens the door, and walks in, shutting it behind them. You weren't able to see for sure if it was your neighbor. You don't actually have proof that's who it was. That leaves you with two possible options to consider. The first option is that the person who just entered your neighbor's house was your neighbor and you just couldn't make them out properly. The second option is that the person who just entered your neighbor's house was actually a completely different person who somehow got a hold of your neighbor's keys and got inside. Both of these options are indeed possible, but one is more plausible than the other. The second option requires you to make a completely baseless assumption, that being that a random person managed to get a hold of your neighbor's keys, whereas the first one demands no such assumptions at all, and is therefore more plausible. So how does this apply to the video? Well, in order to believe the allegations against David, I do have to make one assumption and only one. That all presented victims are telling the truth. The other option would be to dismiss the allegations and try to reach the conclusion that David is innocent. Technically, without hard evidence, this dichotomy of options does exist. But the issue of such a dichotomy is that while the option of believing the allegations only requires one assumption, the option of believing David's innocence requires a lot more. Allow me to go through a quick list of assumptions one would have to make to reach a conclusion that even partially vindicates David. Not even entirely, just partially. First, you have to assume that David was perfectly fine with Tori as a 13-year-old having a massively important position within not only the BPC Discord but BPS in general without any malicious or predatory intent and out of sheer irresponsibility. Second, since it can be proven that flirtatious messages between David and Tori exist, you have to assume that David was perfectly fine with flirting with a minor without any malicious or predatory intent and for some reason didn't immediately cut contact with Tori when this began, once again out of sheer irresponsibility. Third, you have to assume that despite the presence of messages that strongly allude to David and Tori having sexual conversations through Skype, such as the one I showed in this video, that just didn't happen and those messages were entirely intended as jokes, which David was perfectly fine with making with a minor without having any malicious or predatory intent, and out of sheer irresponsibility, yet again. Fourth, you have to assume that David was perfectly fine with members of the community shipping him with a minor without having any malicious or predatory intent, and out of, you guessed it, sheer irresponsibility. Fifth, you have to assume that Tori got a hold of the aforementioned picture of David only wearing a bath towel from a source other than David himself, even though that picture verifiably exists nowhere else on the internet. Sixth, you have to assume that at some point between Tori leaving BPS in November of 2020, she made up a false claim about David having been attracted to her for seemingly no reason at all, and also lied about him flirting with a minor on Twitter and deactivating his account when he was called out for it. Seventh, you have to assume that Tori told this claim specifically to 3 Songs of War endmers and no one else, as opposed to her announcing it publicly, a decision that would be utterly pointless if she just made it up for clout. Eighth, you have to assume that David's old Twitter account, which I verified to have existed at some point, is gone for completely innocent reasons even though we already have an explanation for why it was deactivated from Tori. Ninth, you have to assume that later on, Time came up with false allegations against David and magically lied about the exact pattern of behavior Tori also lied about out of sheer coincidence, despite the two having never spoken to each other before and having no reason to have ever spoken before as they were involved in the community at completely different times. And 10th, you have to assume that Time's DMs with David, where David spoke about an ex-partner of his, were not about Tori even though there are noticeably strong implications that they were and side-by-side proof. So that's 10 assumptions versus the one assumption I'm making. And even then, all you can say with those 10 assumptions is that David isn't a full-on groomer. Even after stretching logic that thin, you still end up with a conclusion where David was at the very least highly irresponsible and negligent around a minor in his community, which, believe it or not, is still bad. And that is as far as you can possibly go, because there's enough hard evidence to stop you in your tracks if you try to go further. Frankly, I'm willing to risk being wrong, because the principle of Occam's razor very clearly favors my stance. In my opinion, David is guilty beyond reasonable doubt, and that is why I chose to make this expose to begin with. We're nearing the end of this video. By now, I've gone over all the allegations made and all the relevant evidence, context, and information backing up these allegations. Let me make one thing very clear. I still haven't told the full story. There are things I've heard from the victims which I've neglected to share as they wouldn't have been okay with it, but ultimately, what I left out doesn't really affect the strength of the evidence against David. I once again ask all of you to show utmost respect to the victims. Do not bother them, do not pester them, and do not f***ing harass them. They've gone through experiences so horrific that I can't even comprehend how they would have felt, and they should not have to relive that trauma, period, point blank. Instead, I ask that you show them support and solidarity, and join them and myself in our efforts to deplatform this vile piece of shit who did this to them in the first place. David RB is a disgusting, sad excuse for a man who has exploited his audience of young children and teenagers to get away with his awful actions for years. The writing has been on the wall from the beginning, as I proved in this video, but he has surrounded himself by people who either can't read it, don't want to read it, or simply don't care. He has yet to be held accountable, even though all evidence points to him having groomed and sexually abused multiple people, including a teenage girl 9 years younger than him when he was an adult. He is a pedophilic predator who has hidden behind the curtain like a slimy, pathetic goblin, and it's time we yank that curtain away and show the Minecraft animation community who he really is. Thank you to everyone who watched to the end. It means a lot to me that you've heard me out. Sincerely, this is the hardest video I've ever had to make. I thought the enchanted mob examination shit was rough, but this is so much worse. Because I genuinely idolize David to an insane degree, and I have never been more disappointed and disgusted in the person before this point. Now, I call upon all of you to spread the word as far as you can. My greatest fear is that this video will fall on deaf ears, and we can't let that happen. David has already wriggled his way out of facing consequences once. Let's not let him do it again. He's a blemish on this community and should be cut out like a cancer tumor for everything he's done. I understand a lot of you watching this video may look up to David as an idol, or at least you may have before. His animations have been watched and enjoyed by countless millions over the years. And that isn't an exaggeration, as his most popular series alone literally has over 200 million views. A lot of people's lives have been positively impacted by this man, so I understand how hard it is to hear what I'm saying. Let me make one thing incredibly clear. I wanted David to be innocent. I really wanted this all to be wrong. Had it not been so blatantly obvious that he's a terrible person, I would have tried to defend him or at least tried to be more charitable, because he's indirectly changed my life for the better too. Hell, I made a whole video about it. It's over 2 years old now, isn't that something? Because of Songs of War, David's biggest project of all time, I met many of my current close friends, had a blast of a year in 2020 despite the circumstances, and was inspired to write fanfiction spanning hundreds of pages. That was all due to his work. I've been involved with the Black Plasma community for 2 years to varying extents, all because of what he created. I've spent hours listening to his behind-the-scenes explanations, tutorials, commentaries, you name it. He always seemed like such a chill guy and a man who greatly cared about his work and his fans. I fucking wish he was the person I always thought he was, but he's not. He deceived all of us, and I'm sorry it happened to you too. That person never existed, and I'm not letting him keep up that facade for a single day more. Lastly, David, if you're watching this final part of the video is directed at you. I would say you ought to be ashamed of yourself, but I know you aren't. You have no shame, no guilt, and no remorse, because instead of facing what you did, you tried to run from it. You hid from the consequences time and time again. I say no more. For the past couple of months, I have felt stabbed in the back. I may not have actually known you, but I gave you endless praise and looked up to you. Your comment on my Songs of War tribute back in 2020 warmed my heart when you first posted it, and now I look at it with disgust. You hurt everyone in your community, every single person, by pretending to be a far better man than you ever were, but we're not the ones you hurt the most. The ultimate victims are Time and Tori, people who trusted you personally, people who you took advantage of and abused to fulfill your sick, perverted fetishes and desires. One of them was barely a fucking teenager and you were in your 20s. You hurt them more than you will ever be able to comprehend, and I bet you don't even care. Go fuck yourself, David. I want you gone, and I never want to see you on the internet again, especially not in the Minecraft animation community. The only place you ought to be is a prison cell, you piece of shit, and I will not rest easy at night until you're put there. That is all.